Hey everyone, it is Dennis Gray and you are tuned in to show number 80 of the Australian Rock Show. Thank you for listening in, and as always, it's great to have you along for the ride. This past week we lost George Young, and as a long-time fan of not just Australian music but rock and roll in general, I speak on behalf of so many of us by saying that his loss is incredibly immense. The purpose of this show is not to look over the life of George Young in detail. It really is, for us anyway, centred around what it's always been about, which is amazing rock and roll. So sit back, folks, and take it all in as we air some of our favourite songs on a show where we pay tribute to the wonderful music which George Young leaves behind. You know, if anyone ever asks you who George Young was, here's what I want you to say. He was a solid and innovative rhythm guitar player, part of a band who, in the 1960s, made the music world sit up and take notice. Then, with his former bandmate Harry Vanda, became one of the most successful songwriting and production teams of all time. Importantly, though, for many of us, he produced and helped guide his younger brother's band, an outfit formed in the suburbs of Sydney, which would go on to kick the rock and roll world square in the arse. Released back in 1975, that is of course AC/DC, that big fat production sound, courtesy of Harry Vanda and George Young, the highly acclaimed and most successful production and songwriting team to come out of Australia. Tonight we are remembering George Young, who passed away recently on the 22nd of October at 70 years of age. If we conducted a poll, I reckon that song would go close to being named the unofficial national anthem of Australia. Agreed? As many of you will know, it was George, having learnt that Bon Scott was once in a pipe band, who encouraged the use of bagpipes in that tune. We all know it and love it, but it really does highlight the innovative ideas which Harry Vanda and George Young applied to their production techniques. You know, compiling this show, as I'm sure others out there who've also recorded tributes for George will agree, has indeed been one of the toughest tasks imaginable due to the sheer number of amazing songs which George Young wrote or co-wrote. Digging into the Easybeats back catalogue is something I suggest the younger listeners do, cause it's an amazing journey, it really, really is. Here's one of my all-time Easybeats tunes, one which is lifted from their second studio album released back in 1966 called Sad and Lonely and Blue. From the second Easybeats record titled It's Too Easy, written by Stevie Wright and George Young, that's the wonderful Sad, Lonely and Blue. George Young had a knack of catchy melodies, and that one is right up there with the best of them. I read online that the It's Too Easy LP reached number 3 on the Kent Music Report charts, was the 7th best-selling album in 1966, right behind Revolver by the Beatles, by the way. And if you're curious, the soundtrack to The Sound of Music was the best-selling album that year. Whilst I think of it, and I guess this is another fun fact, Friday on My Mind by the Easybeats has been covered by over 100 artists. Peter Frampton, The Shadows, David Bowie, Ricky Lee Jones and Gary Moore among them. So there you go. Why don't we play another Easybeats tune? And if you haven't already done so, it's time to crank the volume, folks. From their final album titled Friends, here's the infectious rock and roll boogie. B-side to the final Easybeats single titled Friends, lead vocals by George Young. That was Rock and Roll Boogie, which was released back in May of 1970. Very nearly played the Johnny O'Keefe cover of that song. Of course, it's a ripper, but I thought it was significant to air something from the latter part of the Easybeats career. And Rock and Roll Boogie is up there with the best of them. I've even seen comments from fans over the years who pinpoint the sound of AC/DC to that song, which is an interesting observation. It does, in parts, sound a lot like AC/DC's There's Gonna Be Some Rockin'. You can hear that, but nevertheless, Rock and Roll Boogie is one of my favourite Vanda and Young tunes. I'm sure I saw Stevie Wright do that live in the 80s. Maybe one of our listeners can email us and verify that. Before we get away from the Easybeats, and I guess I'm once again directing this comment to our younger listeners, they really are one of Australia's greatest ever rock and roll outfits. So make an effort to get into their amazing back catalogue. You are tuned in to show number 80 of the Australian Rock Show, an episode where we are honouring the great George Young, who passed away last week, leaving behind a rich musical legacy which will never be surpassed. If you're hoping to hear some of the more well-known songs penned by George and his songwriting partner Harry Vanda, you'd be better off checking out the mainstream media. Of course, we're really rock and roll purists at heart and love digging into an artist's history and exploring their recordings. As I alluded to earlier, as a songwriter, George Young had a talent for punching out catchy melodies, which he did so often throughout his life. It's something many writers struggle with, yet he made it look embarrassingly easy. You need further proof? This is Paintbox from 1972 with the Vanda and Young song Come On Round. Released on President Records in 1972, that is Paintbox with the tune Come On Round. When the Easybeats broke up in late 1969 following their final Australian tour, Harry and George returned to the UK and worked with George's older brother Alex, and they recorded under various aliases with various musicians, including guises such as the aforementioned Paintbox, Moondance and Tramp. Eldest brother Alex Young, or George Alexander as he is often known, figures large in the whole Alberts/ACDC/Young family history, and you are encouraged to research his amazing recordings as well. Maybe we'll have to do an episode on Alex Young in the future. What do you reckon? I hope you are all digging this tribute to George Young. We really could make this a several-volume series, as the catalogue of wonderful music he leaves behind is so vast. I mentioned to my brother that I was going to do a show for George, and his reply was quick and short. Make sure you play Lazy River. And here it is. Recorded at Orange Sound Studios in London, Soho. First released in the UK back in 1970 under the pseudonym Moondance, that is Vanda and Young with the wonderful pop tune Lazy River. Many don't realise just what a great voice George Young had, and you can hear it in all its glory on Lazy River. Love, love, love that tune. I reckon the Easybeats, when they reunited for that tour in 1986, should have re-recorded and released that as a single. Who knows how it would have fared? Let me know your thoughts, australianrockshow@gmail.com. Coincidentally, another band who were riding high at the time of the Easybeats 1986 reunion were Dire Straits, which is a nice little segue into the Sultans of Swing story. Many of you may know this one, many don't. I only learned about it via John Tate's book on Vanda and Young, which was published back in 2010. And it's a great and informative read, by the way. Be sure to search that book out if you're a fan of Australian music. Story goes that the Dire Straits song Sultans of Swing, taken from their debut album back in 1978, is all about George Young and Harry Vanda, and the clues or reference points can be heard in the song's lyrics. Check out Guitar George, he knows all the chords. Mind, he's strictly rhythm. He doesn't want to make it cry or sing. Also, in another verse there is, and Harry doesn't mind if he doesn't make the scene. He's got a daytime job, he's doing all right. He can play the honky-tonk like anything, saving it up for Friday night, which is referring to Harry Vanda and a little reference there to Friday on My Mind. Not sure if there's any truth to that rumour, but it is a nice little nod there to Harry and George, if in fact those lyrics are referring to them. Whenever I hear that song now, I do always think of Vanda and Young anyway. Mark Knopfler, along with George, was also born in Scotland, correct? He is 1949 vintage, which means he'd be a late teenager when the Easybeats are stamping their mark in his part of the world. Anyway, a cool little story there I thought I'd share. Okay, what's next? Why don't we spin the stunning debut from Alison McCallum, which is, of course, the Vanda and Young tune Superman. From 1972, that's Alison McCallum there with the song Superman. You've no doubt been driving along someplace, tuned in to one of Australia's golden oldie radio stations and heard that, unaware it was a Vanda and Young composition, which indeed it is. It was also a top 10 hit at the time of release and was given the disco treatment at the end of the 70s, released as a 12-inch single, hoping to cash in on the Superman movie craze, which was doing big business in the cinemas at that time. Fun fact, the B-side of the Superman 7-inch was written by Ted Mowry and is called Take Me Back. Now, when we had long-time TMG roadie Ron Clayton on the show some time back, show number 42 to be precise, he mentioned that the TMG song I'm Free was indeed very similar to Take Me Back, and indeed it is. Have a listen and check it out for yourselves. Let's not forget Ted Mowry had a major hit in 1971 with the song Falling in Love Again, written of course by Vanda and Young. Folks, it's time to crank the volume as high as she goes. Of course, we're going to crank some of the best power rock tunage which Vanda and Young wrote. Do not call yourself a fan of AC/DC if you do not own the Marcus Hook Roll Band album, Tales of Old Granddaddy. This album, of course, features George and Harry, Alex Young, who we spoke about earlier, along with both Angus and Malcolm Young. This record came out in 1973 and was always super hard to find, but I know it got re-released on CD a few years back and sounds superb. One song off the record, called Natural Man, contains elements of the AC/DC songs Soul Stripper and Livewire. You know, selecting a song off this LP to play was tough, yet we're going to hear Quick Reaction, which has previously been recorded by the outfit Flake, and also contains elements of the AC/DC song TNT. Here are the Marcus Hook Roll Band with Quick Reaction. Lifted from the Tales of Old Granddaddy album, cut back in 1973, that's the Marcus Hook Roll Band with the song Quick Reaction. How can I not play something off Stevie Wright's debut record? I played Evie back on show number 51, where we did a tribute to Stevie who had just passed, so I'm not going to air that. I do recall the time when we'd see Stevie in the 80s. He used to do a killer take of the title track from his debut album, so why don't we hear that? From 1974, that is, of course, Stevie Wright with the tune Hard Road, written and produced by Vanda and Young. Evie, guitar band, commando line, so many great songs on that first Stevie Wright record. And if you dig Australian music, that is one album which should be included in your collection. Great lineup on Hard Road, as many of you'd know, with George on bass and both Harry Vanda and Malcolm Young on guitars. We are looking over just some of the amazing tunes which George Young left us. George, along with Harry Vanda, really were such a dominant force in Australian music throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s. As is well known, they produced the first 6 AC/DC albums and were an essential part of the band's first few years. But their legacy stretches far, far wider than that, including, of course, tasting commercial success recording under the pseudonym Flash in the Pan. And importantly, the contributions they made whilst producing both the Angels and Rose Tattoo were massive. And it's fair to say that if the Angels had have stayed at the Albert stable and continued to work with both Harry and George, they would have taken the rock and roll world title. Many others share that opinion. Another fantastic Aussie hard rock band who Vanda and Young worked with was Cheetah, featuring sisters Lindsay and Chrissy Hammond. Lifted from their Rock and Roll Women album, let's hear Bang Bang. From 1981, that is Cheetah with the track Bang Bang. Lifted off the album Rock and Roll Women, songwriting and production from Harry Vanda and George Young. What an album, so many ripping songs on Rock and Roll Women. Maybe we need to look over that record in an upcoming show too. Drums on that record, of course, are courtesy of Mr. Ray Arnott, a guy whose history is also tied in with Alberts and Vanda and Young. From memory, he recorded with Flash in the Pan as well. An amazing rock and roll history, and one which we looked over back on show number 30 when we interviewed Ray. Make an effort to listen to that one and you'll learn plenty. I hope you all learned something from this special tribute show dedicated to George Young. As I mentioned earlier, selecting music for this episode was extremely difficult as there are so many wonderful songs to select from. That is an indication of the talent which George Young had as a musician and songwriter, and he leaves a wonderful legacy. We're going to close this show out with one of my favourite Easybeats songs, covered, by the way, quite brilliantly by the Saints back in the mid-80s. And now I'm talking about the track The Music Goes Round My Head. AustralianRockShow.com, that's the best place to reach us and to learn more about us and indeed Australia's loudest and proudest rock and roll podcast. Final words on this show are courtesy of respected Australian rock journalist Murray Engelhart, who wrote, "So Australia's true musical genius and sage, George Young, has left the building. The man who quietly but very firmly crafted, shaped and guided early AC/DC based on his own instincts and hard lessons learnt in the Easybeats. He was their chief counsel and grounding point. A man who could almost make inanimate objects move purely through strength of his will. He instilled an attitude and single-mindedness in both Angus and Malcolm, which Mal then adopted and expanded upon to a near art form itself, when Mal fully took the reins of AC/DC. And George was the original Oz rock riffmaster. Listen to the Easybeats, particularly the early and latter day stuff, and hear George laying down the riffage blueprint for all that AC/DC would become. He was a master of any instrument he cared to pick up. He knew how the game worked and eventually came to dictate how it was played. And he was a stunning vocal mimic. An enormous loss that will leave a crater that will never even come close to being filled.